The girl behind the general store counter dropped the tin of baking powder the moment Kieran Anderson's shadow fell across the threshold, and he watched her scramble backward until her spine hit the shelves, sending jars rattling in their places. Monticello, Utah had seen its share of broken souls drift through since the railroad pushed west in 1881, but this one was different. Kieran had noticed her 3 weeks ago when he'd come down from his cabin in the Abajo Mountains for supplies, saw how she moved like a spooked deer, how her eyes never quite met anyone's gaze straight on. The shopkeeper, old Gerald Morton, had introduced her as Tessa Zimmerman, said she'd arrived on the stage from Denver with nothing but a worn carpetbag and desperate need of work. "I can wait outside if you need," Kieran said, keeping his voice low and even, the same tone he used with wounded animals in the high country. He stayed in the doorway, letting the September sun stream past his broad shoulders, not moving an inch closer. Tessa's breathing came fast and shallow. She was small, maybe 20 years to his 26, with dark blonde hair pulled back severe from a face that might have been pretty if fear hadn't carved itself into every line. Her hands trembled as she bent to retrieve the fallen tin, and Kieran noticed the way she kept the counter between them like a barricade. "No, sir," she whispered, and even those 2 words sounded like they cost her something. "What can I help you find?" Gerald emerged from the back room, wiping his hands on his apron, and Kieran saw relief flood Tessa's features at the older man's presence. "Kieran, good to see you. Down from the mountain already? Thought you usually waited until first snow." "Running low on ammunition and coffee," Kieran said, still standing in the doorway. He was a big man, 6'3", with the kind of muscle that came from splitting wood, hauling water, and surviving winters that would kill softer men. His dark hair brushed his shoulders, and his beard needed trimming, but his eyes were gentle when they settled on things that needed gentleness. "And I could use some flour, sugar, salt." "I'll get that together for you," Gerald said, but Kieran shook his head. "No hurry. I've got other business in town. I can come back near closing time if that suits." He saw Tessa's shoulders drop just slightly, saw the way her white-knuckled grip on the counter loosened a fraction. Gerald looked between them, understanding dawning in his weathered face. "Closing time would be fine," the old man said quietly. "We'll have everything ready." Kieran touched the brim of his hat and stepped back into the street, letting the autumn air fill his lungs. Monticello wasn't much to speak of, just a collection of buildings huddled in the shadow of the mountains. But it served the ranchers, the miners, the men like him who preferred solitude to civilization. The town had grown some since the Mormons had established it back in 1887, now boasting 2 saloons, a proper church, a small hotel, and Morton's general store. He spent the afternoon at the blacksmith's getting his traps repaired, then stopped at the stable to check on his horse. The sun was painting the mountains gold and purple by the time he returned to the store, and through the window he could see Gerald turning the sign to closed. Inside, Tessa was sweeping, her movements quick and efficient. She stiffened when the bell above the door chimed, but didn't drop the broom this time. "Progress," Kieran thought. "Got everything sorted for you," Gerald said, gesturing to a crate on the counter. "Tessa helped me get it all together. She's got a good head for numbers. I appreciate it." Kieran pulled coins from his pocket, counting them out slowly. "Miss Zimmerman, did Gerald figure the total right? I'd value a second opinion." It was a transparent excuse to include her, and all 3 of them knew it, but Tessa moved to the counter anyway, keeping it between them. Her fingers moved over the list Gerald had written, lips moving silently as she calculated. "It's correct, sir," she said, voice barely above a whisper. "Kieran," he said. "Just Kieran. No need for sir." Her eyes flicked up to his face for just a second before darting away, and he saw something there beneath the fear. Curiosity, maybe, or the ghost of who she'd been before whatever had happened to put that flinch in her movements. "I'll carry this out for you," Gerald offered, but Kieran waved him off. "I've got it. You two have a good evening." He hefted the crate easily, muscles flexing under his worn flannel shirt, and headed out into the gathering dusk. But he'd seen the way Tessa had relaxed slightly when he'd kept his distance, had noticed how she'd managed to speak a little more each time he'd addressed her directly. Something twisted in his chest, something protective and fierce, and he found himself wondering what kind of man would break a woman down to nothing but fear and trembling. The ride back up the mountain took 2 hours in the dark, but Kieran knew the trail like he knew his own heartbeat. His cabin sat in a clearing surrounded by pine and aspen, a solid structure he'd built with his own hands 5 years ago when he'd decided he'd had enough of other people's wars, other people's problems. He'd fought in the last of the Apache campaigns down in Arizona territory, had seen enough blood and death to last him several lifetimes, and had come to these mountains to find something resembling peace. Mostly, he'd succeeded. He trapped in winter, hunted year-round, and brought furs and meat down to Monticello when he needed supplies or human contact. It was a good life, a simple life, and it suited him. But that night, sitting by his fire with coffee growing cold in his cup, he couldn't stop thinking about brown eyes that wouldn't meet his, and hands that shook when they tried to do simple tasks. The next time he came down to Monticello was 2 weeks later, earlier than he'd planned. He told himself it was because he'd forgotten to get new boots and winter was coming on, but the truth sat heavier than that, and he was too honest a man to ignore it completely. The store was busy when he arrived, 3 ranch hands from the double bar buying supplies. Kieran waited outside, watching through the window as Tessa helped Gerald fill their order. She moved efficiently, but he saw how she angled herself to keep distance, how she handed things across the counter rather than risk anyone getting close. One of the hands, a big kid with more swagger than sense, said something that made the others laugh. Tessa's face went white, and she took a step back. The kid reached across the counter, maybe trying to be friendly, maybe not, and Tessa gasped and dropped the bag of flour she'd been holding. White powder exploded across the floor and her eyes went wide with panic. Kieran was through the door before he'd made a conscious decision to move. "Easy," he said, his voice carrying across the store. Not loud, but with enough weight that everyone turned to look. "You boys got everything you need." The ranch hands recognized him. Most people in these parts knew Kieran Anderson by reputation, if not by sight. Mountain Man, they called him, and there were stories about his time as an army scout, about things he'd done and seen. True or not, the stories carried weight. "Just about done here," the kid said, his hand dropping away from the counter. "Didn't mean to startle her. I'm sure you didn't." Kieran moved into the store but stayed near the door, giving everyone space. "Gerald, these gentlemen ready to settle up?" "Just finishing now," the old shopkeeper said, shooting Kieran a grateful look. The transaction completed quickly after that, the ranch hands loading their supplies and heading out. When the door closed behind them, Tessa was on her hands and knees, trying to clean up the spilled flour with shaking hands. Tears streaked through the white powder on her face. "I am sorry," she whispered. "I will pay for it. I will work extra hours. I am so sorry." "Tessa, girl, it's fine," Gerald said, kneeling beside her with a dustpan. "It was an accident." "I am sorry," she repeated like she couldn't hear him, like the words were stuck on repeat. "Please, I am sorry. I did not mean to. I will fix it." Kieran stayed where he was, but he lowered himself to sitting on the floor near the door, making himself smaller, less threatening. Miss Zimmerman, he said quietly. Tessa, can you tell me 3 things you can see right now? She looked up at him, confusion breaking through the panic. 3 things, he repeated. Just look around and tell me 3 things you can see. The counter, she said hesitantly. Good, what else? The shelves, with the preserves. That's 2, one more. Her eyes moved around the room and landed on him. You, that's right. Now, can you tell me 2 things you can hear? She tilted her head, listening. The wind outside. And your voice. Good, now 1 thing you can touch. Just reach out and touch something. She pressed her palm against the floorboard beneath her. The floor, it's smooth. Her breathing had slowed. The panic was retreating from her eyes, leaving exhaustion in its wake. Kieran had seen soldiers lose themselves to fear in the middle of battle, had learned ways to bring them back. Seemed it worked for other kinds of battles too. Where did you learn that? Gerald asked quietly. Army, Kieran said. Had a captain who knew about such things. Saved more than 1 man from drowning in his own head. He looked at Tessa. You back with us now, she nodded, wiping at her face and just smearing the flour around. Something that might have been a smile flickered across her features. I must look ridiculous. You look like someone who had a fright, Kieran said. Nothing ridiculous about that. There's a pump out back if you want to wash up. Gerald and I can handle the mess in here. She stood slowly, still shaking, and made her way to the back of the store. When she was gone, Gerald let out a long breath. Thank you for that. I didn't know what to do. She running from something? Kieran asked, helping sweep flour into the dustpan. Someone more like. She hasn't said much, but what she has said. Gerald shook his head. Husband, I think. Up in Denver. The way she flinches from men, the way she apologizes for breathing. I've seen it before. My sister had a husband like that before he drank himself to death. Anger sparked hot in Kieran's chest, but he kept it off his face. She's safe here, far as I know. She's been using her mother's maiden name, I think. Zimmerman. Said she's got no family left, nowhere else to go. Gerald dumped the ruined flour in the waste bin. She's a good worker when she's not spooked. Smart, quick with figures, never complains. I gave her the room above the store. It's not much, but it's hers. That's good of you. Well, I'm not getting any younger and my Mary's been gone 3 years now. Nice having someone around, even if she barely says 2 words most days. Gerald looked at Kieran. You planning to come down from that mountain more often? Seems like she does better with you around, strange as that might sound. Kieran considered that. I've got traps to set before the snow flies. That's not what I asked. No, it wasn't. Kieran stood, brushing flour from his pants. I might make it down once a week or so. Need to stockpile supplies anyway, and I could use the company before winter locks me in. Gerald's weathered face creased in a knowing smile. Sure, supplies. Tessa emerged from the back, her face clean but still pale. She'd pinned her hair back more securely and straightened her dress. I am sorry for the disruption, she said formally, not quite looking at either of them. Nothing to be sorry for, Gerald said firmly. But if you're feeling steadier, maybe you could help Kieran here find what he needs. I've got to run over to the hotel, promised Martha I'd look at her stove before supper. It was an obvious excuse, and Tessa's eyes widened slightly at being left alone with Kieran, but she nodded. Gerald patted her shoulder gently, telegraphing the movement so she could see it coming, and headed out. Silence filled the store. Kieran stayed where he was, near the back, giving Tessa space and the clear path to the door if she needed it. I need boots, he said finally. And some soap if you've got any that doesn't smell like flowers. We have lye soap, she said, moving behind the counter. And boots are over there, but I do not know what size you need. Mind if I take a look? Of course not. It is your money. He moved slowly toward the boot display, telegraphing every movement, keeping his hands visible. Up close, He could see the shadows under her eyes, the way her dress hung a little loose on her frame like she'd lost weight recently. She watched him from behind the counter, ready to bolt. "That thing I did earlier," Kieran said, examining a pair of boots, "with the counting things you can see and hear. It's a good trick to know when your mind gets away from you. Works for nightmares too sometimes." "You have nightmares?" The question came out before she could stop it, and she looked surprised at herself. "Used to. Still do sometimes, though they're better now." He set down one pair of boots and picked up another. "I was an Army scout for a while down in Arizona, saw some things that stick with you." "I did not know the Army had scouts." "Someone's got to know the land, track the enemy, find water where there isn't any. I grew up in these mountains, learned tracking from a Ute man who worked for my father. When the Army needed scouts, it seemed like a good idea." He smiled without humor. "I was younger and dumber then. But you survived." "I did. And when my time was up, I came back here and built a cabin where the only thing I have to track is deer and the occasional bear." He found boots that looked like they'd fit and brought them to the counter. "Sometimes surviving means knowing when to step away from the fight." He saw understanding flicker in her eyes and something else. Hope, maybe, or the beginning of it. "How much do I owe you?" he asked. She calculated quickly. $3.40. He counted out the money, making sure to place it on the counter so she could pick it up without their hands touching. "Thank you, Tessa." "You are welcome." She paused, gathering courage. "And thank you for earlier. That thing you did, it helped. I'm glad." He gathered his purchases. "I'll be back next week, probably. Need to get a few more things before the snow starts. We will be here." He could feel her watching him as he left, and when he glanced back through the window, she was still standing at the counter, looking less like she might shatter at any moment. The week that followed dragged longer than it should have. Kieran set his trap lines, stocked wood for the winter, repaired the roof where a branch had damaged some shingles. He told himself he was just being practical, preparing for the hard months ahead, but his thoughts kept drifting down the mountain to a girl with haunted eyes and a tremor in her hands. When he rode into Monticello the following Saturday, he found the town in the grip of early autumn celebrations. Someone had organized a harvest dance at the church hall, and families were gathering as the sun set. Music drifted through the street, fiddle and guitar playing something lively. The store was empty when he entered. Tessa stood at the window, watching the people outside with an expression of such longing it made Kieran's chest ache. "You should go," he said, and she spun around, hand flying to her throat. "I did not hear you come in. Sorry, didn't mean to startle you." He stayed by the door. "But you should go, to the dance." "No," she shook her head quickly. "No, I cannot. Why not? I do not dance. And there will be people and men and I." She trailed off, wrapping her arms around herself. "You don't have to dance," Kieran said. "Could just listen to the music. Have some of whatever food they're serving. Gerald probably closed the store early for it." "He did. He asked me to come, but I said no." She turned back to the window. "I used to love dancing, before. One word that carried the weight of whatever had broken her. What if I went with you?" The words came out before Kieran had fully thought them through, but once they were out there, he didn't take them back. She looked at him, surprise evident on her face. "You want to go to a dance?" "Not particularly. I'm not much for crowds either. But I figure we could stand in the back, listen to some music, and if it gets to be too much, we leave. No pressure." "Why would you do that?" "Because you look like you want to go, and because sitting up here alone watching through the window seems like a lonely way to spend an evening." He met her eyes. "And because I think maybe you could use a friend and I'm volunteering for the position." She studied him for a long moment, and he let her look. Let her see that he meant what he said, that he wasn't pushing for anything beyond what he'd stated. "If I want to leave, we leave." she asked. "The second you say the word. And you will not try to make me dance. I won't even try to make you smile, though I'd count it a victory if you did." That got him the faintest quirk of her lips, not quite a smile but closer than he'd seen before. "All right," she said quietly. "Just for a little while." She got a shawl from upstairs, a faded blue thing that had seen better days, and they walked to the church hall together. Kieran kept a careful distance between them, hands in his pockets, matching his longer stride to her shorter one. People were already inside, the music loud and joyful, and he felt Tessa tense as they approached the door. "Remember," he said, "anytime you want to leave." She nodded, and they went inside. The hall was packed with families, ranchers, townspeople. Children ran between the adults while couples danced in the center of the room. Tables lined the walls, laden with food, and someone had strung up lanterns that cast everything in warm, golden light. Kieran guided them to a spot in the back corner, positioning himself between Tessa and the bulk of the crowd. She pressed her back against the wall, eyes wide, taking everything in. "You doing all right?" he asked. "Yes, it is just a lot. We can go if you need to." "No, I want to try." She watched the dancers spin and turn. "It has been so long since I heard music." They stood there for 3 songs, Kieran watching the room while Tessa watched the dancers. Gradually, he felt some of the tension leave her shoulders. Her foot started tapping in time with the music, unconscious and natural. Gerald spotted them and made his way over, a cup of punch in each hand. "Thought you two might want something to drink." "Thank you," Tessa said, accepting the cup carefully. "Glad you came, girl. Does my heart good to see you out." Gerald looked at Kieran. "And you too, mountain man. Didn't expect to see you at one of these." "Full of surprises," Kieran said dryly, taking the other cup. The music shifted to something slower, and Gerald excused himself to ask the widow Henderson to dance. Couples paired off, moving in gentle circles. Tessa watched with that same longing expression. "Tell me about before," Kieran said quietly, "when you used to love dancing." She was silent so long he thought she wouldn't answer. "Then, my father taught me." He was a banker in Philadelphia, very proper, but he loved to dance. "My mother would play the piano and he would dance with me in the parlor, teaching me the steps." Her voice went soft with memory. "He said every girl should know how to dance, because dancing was like joy made visible." "Sounds like a good man." He was. They both were. "They died of typhoid when I was 17. There was no money left after the debts were paid, so I went to work for a family friend. That is where I met Thomas." The name came out bitter and small. Kieran waited, letting her choose what to tell. "He was charming at first, courteous. He seemed so steady, so safe. We married when I was 18, and for 6 months it was good. Then he lost his job and started drinking, and the hitting started." She said it flatly, like she was reporting facts about someone else's life. "It got worse. He would apologize after, buy me flowers, promise it would never happen again. But it always did. When he broke my ribs last spring, I knew if I stayed he would eventually kill me. So I took what little money I had hidden and got on a stage heading west. I kept going until the money ran out, and that was Monticello." Kieran's hands had curled into fists. He forced them open, forced his breathing to stay steady. "He doesn't know where you are." "I do not think so. I used my mother's maiden name, told no one where I was going, but I am still afraid. Every time I hear heavy footsteps, every time a man moves too fast, I think it is him." She looked down at her cup. "I am tired of being afraid." "Fear's got its place," Kieran said. "Keeps you alive when you need it, but you're right that it's no way to live long term." He took a breath. "For what it's worth, you're one of the bravest people I've met. It takes more courage to run toward a new life than to stay in a terrible one because it's familiar." She looked up at him, and her eyes were bright with unshed tears. "You really think so?" "I know so." I've seen soldiers fall apart over less. The music swelled, something bright and hopeful, and on impulse Kieran held out his hand, palm up, not moving it toward her. "What are you doing?" she asked, offering. "Not insisting. If you wanted to dance, we could dance right here. We don't have to go out there with everyone else. But your father was right about dancing being joy made visible, and it seems a shame for you to lose that because of a man who didn't deserve you in the first place." She stared at his outstretched hand like it was a snake that might bite. He kept it there, steady, waiting, giving her all the time in the world to decide. Finally, slowly, she reached out and placed her hand in his. Her fingers were small and cold in his grip, trembling like a bird's wings. Kieran closed his hand gently around hers, barely any pressure, and brought his other hand to hover near her waist. "Tell me if anything is too much," he said. She nodded and placed her free hand on his shoulder, light as a feather. They swayed there in the corner, barely moving, while around them the other couples spun and twirled. Kieran kept his movements small and predictable, leading her through the simplest version of the waltz, giving her all the space she needed to breathe. "You are a good dancer," she said after a moment. "My mother insisted on lessons, said civilization was important even on the frontier." He smiled at the memory. "I hated every minute of it until I actually needed to know how." "When was that?" "There was a girl. I was 16, she was 15. Her father threw a party and I wanted to impress her." He guided Tessa through a gentle turn. "Ended up stepping on her feet half the night, but she laughed about it, so I counted it a win." "What happened to her?" "She married a lawyer and moved to Salt Lake City. Last I heard, she had 4 children and was happy." He met Tessa's eyes. "Sometimes things work out the way they're supposed to." They danced through 2 more songs, and with each passing minute, Tessa relaxed a little more. She still tensed when other people came near, still kept a careful distance between their bodies, but some of the fear had left her eyes. When the music shifted to something fast and energetic, they stepped apart by unspoken agreement. "Thank you," she said, and this time when she smiled, it reached her eyes. "I had forgotten what that felt like. Anytime you want to remember, you let me know." They stayed for another hour, eating food that the church ladies had prepared, listening to the music, watching children dart between the dancers. Kieran introduced Tessa to some of the ranchers he knew, good men with kind wives, and he watched her slowly, haltingly, start to engage in conversation. When they finally left, the moon was high and bright, turning Monticello silver. Kieran walked Tessa back to the store, keeping his distance but staying close enough that she was clearly under his protection. Anyone watching would know she wasn't alone. At the door to the store, she turned to face him. "I do not know how to thank you for tonight." "No thanks needed. I had a better time than I expected." "You will come back?" The question came out uncertain, vulnerable. "Next week," he promised. "Maybe the week after that, too." "Winter's still a ways off." "Good." She clutched her shawl tighter. "Kieran, that technique you taught me for when I start to panic. Could you teach me more things like that? Ways to manage when the fear gets too big?" "I'd be happy to. I'm no expert, but I learned a few tricks that help." "That is more than I have now." She went inside, and he waited until he heard the bolt slide home before heading to the stable to collect his horse. The ride back up the mountain felt longer than usual, and his cabin seemed emptier when he arrived. The weeks that followed fell into a pattern. Kieran came down to Monticello every Saturday, sometimes staying overnight at the small hotel, sometimes riding back up in the dark. He'd stop at the store, buy supplies he sometimes didn't really need, and he and Tessa would talk. At first, their conversations were brief and surface level. The weather, the quality of the apples that had come in, how his trapping was going. But gradually, as Tessa learned that Kieran kept his promises and respected her boundaries, She opened up more. She told him about Philadelphia, about her childhood before everything went wrong. He told her about growing up in Utah Territory, about his mother who died when he was 12, his father who drunk himself to death 2 years later, about the Ute man, Nasaku, who'd taken a grieving 14-year-old boy under his wing and taught him how to survive in the mountains. "Where is Nasaku now?" Tessa asked one afternoon. They were sitting on the bench outside the store, carefully positioned with space between them, watching the autumn leaves tumble down the street. "Dead," Kieran said. "Killed by settlers who didn't care that he'd been peaceful, that he'd spent his life trying to build bridges. They just saw an Indian and shot him." The old anger stirred, but it was dulled by time and grief. "That was part of why I joined the army. Thought maybe I could make a difference, protect people like him. Took me a while to figure out I was just part of the same machine that had killed him in the first place. That must have been hard." "It was, but it taught me something important." He looked at her. "Sometimes the only person you can save is yourself, and that's not selfish, that's survival." She was quiet for a moment. "Is that what I did? Save myself?" "That's exactly what you did." "It does not always feel that way. Sometimes it feels like I just ran away." "Running away from something that's killing you isn't cowardice. It's sense." He shifted on the bench, angling toward her. "Can I tell you something Nasaku used to say, please?" He said that people are like trees. You can bend a tree with wind and weight, you can even break branches off, but if the roots are strong, it'll keep growing. Sometimes in a different direction than it started, sometimes twisted up and strange-looking but still growing, still alive. Kieran picked up a leaf that had fallen on the bench between them. "You bent, Tessa. You even broke in places, but you're still growing. That takes a kind of strength most people never have to find." She took the leaf from his hand, careful not to let their fingers touch. "Sometimes I do not feel strong. Strength isn't the absence of fear. It's moving forward even when you're terrified. You do that every day." The conversation shifted to lighter topics after that, but Kieran saw her turning the leaf over and over in her fingers, thinking. October brought the first real cold, frost painting the windows in the mornings. Kieran increased his visits to twice a week, telling himself it was because he needed to finish stockpiling supplies before the snow locked him in. The truth was more complicated, but he wasn't ready to examine it too closely yet. Tessa was changing. Slowly, gradually, like ice melting in spring. She smiled more. She'd started wearing her hair down sometimes, soft waves framing her face. She no longer flinched every time someone moved near her, though she still kept careful distance from most men. But not from Kieran. She'd let him sit closer now, let their shoulders brush sometimes when they were looking at something together. Once, when they were going over the store's account books because she wanted his opinion on some figures, her hand had touched his, and she hadn't yanked it away. Just left it there for a heartbeat before moving it naturally, like it was nothing. It wasn't nothing, and they both knew it. "There's going to be a church social next Sunday," Gerald mentioned one day when Kieran was loading supplies. "Potluck supper, singing the usual. You should come down for it." "I'll think about it," Kieran said, which they both knew meant yes. The social was smaller than the harvest dance, more intimate. Tables had been set up in the churchyard, covered with dishes that the community had brought. Kieran arrived with a haunch of venison he'd smoked, which was received with enthusiasm. He found Tessa helping set up, arranging plates and utensils with precise care. She'd worn a different dress, dark green instead of her usual brown, and someone had lent her a ribbon for her hair. "You look nice," he said, and immediately felt foolish. Nice, like she was 12 years old. But she smiled, color touching her cheeks. "Thank you. Mrs. Henderson gave me the ribbon. She said green brings out my eyes." She's right about that. The afternoon passed pleasantly. Kieran found himself drawn into conversations with ranchers about the coming winter, with miners about the new shaft they were sinking up in the hills. But he kept an eye on Tessa, watching as she talked with the church ladies, as she helped serve food, as she slowly, carefully, reintegrated herself into human society. When the singing started, she came to sit beside him on a bench at the edge of the gathering. Not touching, but closer than she would have a month ago. "Are you going to sing?" she asked. "Not unless you want everyone to leave. I've got a voice like a rusty saw." She laughed, and the sound was so unexpected and genuine that several people turned to look. Tessa noticed and ducked her head, but she was still smiling. "I used to sing," she said quietly, "in the church choir back in Philadelphia. You should join the one here. Maybe." She tilted her head, listening to the hymn the group was singing. "Maybe I will." They sat in comfortable silence as the sun set and the air grew cold. Someone built up the fire in the pit, and the gathering drew closer to its warmth. Children ran circles in the dusk, their laughter high and clear. "Kieran," Tessa's voice was soft, almost lost under the singing. "Yeah." "Do you ever get lonely up on the mountain, all by yourself?" He considered the question. "Sometimes, especially in deep winter when I can't get down to town for weeks at a time. But mostly no. I've got the quiet, the stars, the wildlife. It's enough." He paused. "Why do you ask?" "I was wondering if I would like it. Being alone like that. I spent so long wishing to be alone, to be away from Thomas, that I thought solitude would feel like freedom. But now I have it, and sometimes it just feels lonely." "Solitude and loneliness aren't the same thing," Kieran said. "Solitude is a choice. It's peaceful. Loneliness is something that happens to you, usually when you're around people who don't see you for who you really are." "Were you lonely in the army?" "Every damn day," he admitted. "Surrounded by hundreds of men and lonely as a stone. That's when I knew I had to leave, when I had to find something different." "And did you find something different?" He looked at her, at the firelight painting gold across her features, at the way she'd turned toward him like a flower toward the sun. "I think maybe I did." The air between them shifted, charged with something unspoken. Tessa's eyes widened slightly, and Kieran could see her processing his words, understanding the layers beneath them. "I should help clean up," she said, standing quickly. "Tessa, wait." He stood too, but didn't move toward her. "Did I say something wrong?" "No, no, you did not. I just—" She wrapped her arms around herself. "I need a minute, please." He watched her walk toward the church, disappearing into the shadows. Gerald appeared at his elbow, looking concerned. "What happened?" "I'm not sure," Kieran said. "We were talking, and then she just needed to leave." "Give her time," the old man advised. "She's come a long way, but there's still a lot of healing left to do. Opening yourself up to someone new, especially after what she went through, that's terrifying." "I wasn't trying to push." "I know you weren't, but feelings don't always wait for permission." Kieran found Tessa sitting on the church steps, looking out at the mountains. He approached slowly, making noise so she'd hear him coming, and stopped a few feet away. "Can I sit?" he asked. She nodded, and he lowered himself to the step, leaving space between them. "I am sorry," she said. "I did not mean to run off like that. You've got nothing to be sorry for." "I do, though. You have been nothing but kind to me, nothing but patient, and I keep—" She trailed off, frustrated. "I keep being broken." "You're not broken," Kieran said firmly. "You're healing. There's a difference." "Is there?" She turned to look at him, and in the moonlight he could see tears on her face. "Because I do not feel like I am healing. I feel like I am stuck, afraid to move forward because I do not know if I can trust myself to choose right. I made such a terrible choice with Thomas. What if I make another terrible choice? You won't. How can you know that? Because you're not the same person you were when you married him." You've survived things that would have broken most people. You've learned to recognize danger. You've learned to listen to your instincts. He held her gaze. And your instincts are telling you something right now. The question is whether you're going to listen to them or let fear make the decision. She was quiet for a long moment. My instincts are telling me that you are a good man, that I am safe with you, that when I am near you I feel less broken and more like who I used to be. Then trust that. But what if I am wrong? What if you're right? She laughed, shaky but real. That is a terrifying thought. Why? Because if I am right, then I have to be brave enough to try, to open myself up to being hurt again, and I do not know if I can do that. Kieran shifted slightly, turning to face her more fully. Can I tell you what I see when I look at you? All right. I see someone who got on a stage with nothing but a carpet bag and the clothes on her back. Someone who traveled hundreds of miles alone to a place she'd never been, with no guarantee of safety or success. Someone who walks into a general store every day and faces her fears, who went to a dance even though crowds terrify her, who's learning to sing again and smile again and live again. He kept his voice gentle but firm. That's not a broken person, Tessa. That's one of the bravest people I've ever met. You keep saying that, because it's true, and I'm going to keep saying it until you believe it. He extended his hand, palm up, in the space between them. I'm not asking for anything you're not ready to give. I'm just asking you to consider that maybe, possibly, you deserve something good, and maybe I could be part of that good if you'd let me. She looked at his hand, at his face, at the mountains rising dark against the stars. He saw the war playing out in her expression, fear against hope, past against future. Then, slowly, she reached out and took his hand. Her fingers curled around his, warm despite the cold air, and Kieran felt something in his chest unlock. He didn't pull her closer, didn't take more than she was offering, just held her hand, sitting on the church steps while the social continued behind them and the night deepened around them. I do not know how to do this, she whispered. Neither do I. We'll figure it out together. What if I need to go slow? Then we'll go slow. What if I cannot be what you want? Tessa, I want you to be exactly who you are, nothing more, nothing less. She leaned her head against his shoulder, tentative and testing. When he didn't move except to gently squeeze her hand, she relaxed against him. They sat that way for a long time, until Gerald came looking for them to say the social was ending. They walked back together, still holding hands, and Kieran felt the weight of curious eyes on them but didn't care. Let people look. Let them see that Tessa Zimmerman had someone who'd stand beside her. The first snow came in mid-November, light flurries that dusted the mountains white and melted by afternoon. Kieran knew he had maybe 2 more weeks before the serious weather set in, before the trails became impassable and he'd be locked in his cabin until spring. The thought of months without seeing Tessa felt intolerable. "Come with me," he said one afternoon. They were in the store, supposedly taking inventory but mostly just talking while Gerald minded the counter. "What?" She looked up from the list she was making. "Come up to the cabin with me, just for a day. I want to show you where I live, what my life is like. Let you see if you could ever imagine being part of it. Kieran, I cannot just go off into the mountains with you. People would talk. Let them talk. But if you're worried about propriety, Gerald could come as chaperone, or Mrs. Henderson, He ran a hand through his hair, frustrated with his inability to find the right words. "I'm going to be gone for months, and I need to know if what's happening between us is something that can survive that. I need to know if you feel it too." "I feel it," she said quietly. "I am terrified of it, but I feel it. Then come see my world, one day, that's all I'm asking." She worried her bottom lip between her teeth, thinking, if Mrs. Henderson came as chaperone, I'd welcome her company. "Then yes, all right, I will come." They made the trip 3 days later, Mrs. Henderson bundled in furs on Kieran's extra horse while Tessa rode behind him, arms wrapped around his waist. It was the closest they'd been, her body pressed against his back, and through the layers of clothing he could feel her warmth. The cabin sat in a clearing ringed by pines, solid and well-made, with a stone chimney and real glass windows. Smoke curled from the chimney where Kieran had left the fire banked. "Oh," Tessa breathed as they approached. "It is beautiful. It's simple," he said, helping her down from the horse. "But it's home." Inside, the cabin was one large room with a sleeping loft above. A bed sat in one corner, a table and chairs in another. Shelves lined the walls, filled with supplies, traps, tools. Everything was neat and organized, a place for everything and everything in its place. "You keep it very clean," Mrs. Henderson observed, looking around with approval. "Learned that in the Army. Plus up here, organization can mean the difference between life and death. If I need something in a blizzard, I need to be able to find it." He showed them around, pointing out the root cellar where he stored vegetables and meat, the shed where he kept his traps and tools, the small barn for his horse. The view from the cabin looked out over the valley, Monticello a distant collection of buildings far below. "In winter, that view looks like a painting," Kieran said, standing beside Tessa. "Everything white and clean, the sky so blue it hurts to look at." "It must be lonely," she said. "It can be. But it's also peaceful in a way nothing else is. No one telling you what to do, what to think. Just you and the mountain and the quiet." Mrs. Henderson, with the tact of a woman who'd lived 70 years and knew when to make herself scarce, announced she was going to gather some of the late autumn berries she'd spotted near the clearing. That left Kieran and Tessa alone in the cabin. "What do you think?" he asked. "Could you see yourself here?" She walked around the room, touching things lightly. His few books, the quilt on the bed that his mother had made, the rifle above the fireplace. "I do not know. It is so different from anything I have known." "I'm not asking you to decide today. I'm just asking you to consider it." "Consider what, exactly?" She turned to face him. "What are you asking me, Kieran?" He took a breath, knowing this was the moment. Either he said what he felt or he let her go back down the mountain without knowing. "I'm asking if you think you could love me, Tessa. If you think you could build a life with me. Up here or down in town or anywhere else you want. I know it's too soon. I know you're still healing. But come spring, when the snow melts and I can get back down to Monticello, I want to court you properly. I want to give you time to be sure, time to trust me and yourself. And then, if you'll have me, I want to marry you." She stared at him, eyes wide. "You want to marry me?" "More than I've wanted anything in a long time. But you barely know me. I know you're brave and kind. I know you're smart and funny when you let yourself be. I know you've survived hell and came out the other side still hoping for something better. I know that when I'm with you, I feel like I've found something I didn't even know I was looking for." He stayed where he was, giving her space. "I know that's not everything, and I know there's more to learn. That's why I want time. Time for you to be sure, time for you to heal completely, time for us to build something real." "Thomas said he loved me," she whispered. "He said he'd care for me, protect me, and then he hurt me in ways I am still trying to understand. I am not Thomas." Kieran's voice was firm but gentle. "I will never be Thomas. If you say yes to me, you'll be saying yes to someone who'll keep his word, someone who'll move at your pace, respect your boundaries, and put your well-being above his own wants. I'm asking for a chance, Tessa. That's all. A chance to prove that not all men are like the one who hurt you." Tears were streaming down her face now, but she was smiling too. "I want to believe you. I want to believe that so badly." "Then believe it. Take a leap of faith." She crossed the distance between them in 3 quick steps and threw her arms around him. Kieran caught her, holding her carefully, mindful of her boundaries even as she pressed close. She was crying into his shirt, her whole body shaking. "I am so scared," she sobbed. "I am so scared of getting hurt again." I know you are." He stroked her hair gently. "And I can't promise I'll never hurt you because people hurt each other sometimes even when they don't mean to. But I can promise I'll never raise my hand to you. I'll never tear you down or make you small. I'll never give you reason to fear me." She pulled back enough to look up at him. Come spring. That gives you the whole winter to think about it, to be sure. And if you decide you don't want this, I'll respect that. We'll stay friends if that's what you need. And if I decide I do want it, then we'll take it slow. Court properly. Let you learn to trust me fully. And when you're ready, when you're absolutely certain, we'll get married and build a life together." She reached up and touched his face, fingers tracing the line of his jaw. It was the most intimate gesture she'd ever initiated, and Kieran held perfectly still, letting her explore. "You are nothing like him," she said wonderingly. "Nothing at all. No, I'm not. I think I could love you, Kieran Anderson. I think maybe I already do." His heart felt too big for his chest. "Yeah. Yes," she smiled through her tears. "It terrifies me, but yes." He bent his head slowly, giving her every opportunity to pull away, and pressed a gentle kiss to her forehead. She sighed and leaned into him, and they stood that way until Mrs. Henderson's voice called from outside that she'd found enough berries to make a pie. The ride back down the mountain felt different. Tessa's arms around his waist held tighter, more secure, and when they stopped halfway down to rest the horses, she laced her fingers through his without hesitation. "Spring will come," she said, looking up at the sky where clouds were gathering. "It always does. Will you write to me?" "During the winter. If I can get letters out, I will, but it might not be possible once the deep snow hits. Then I will just have to wait." She squeezed his hand. "I am good at waiting." The first real blizzard hit 2 weeks later. Kieran had made it down to Monticello one last time, loaded up on supplies, and said his goodbyes. The hardest goodbye was to Tessa. They stood in the store, Gerald tactfully busy in the back room, and Kieran memorized everything about her. The way her hair fell around her face, the dusting of freckles across her nose, the smile that came easier now than it had 2 months ago. "Stay safe," she said, adjusting his coat collar even though it didn't need adjusting. "Always do. You stay safe too. I will have Gerald and Mrs. Henderson to look after me. And I am going to join the church choir like you suggested." "Good, that's good." He wanted to kiss her, wanted it so badly his teeth ached, but he held back. She wasn't ready and he wouldn't push. "Come spring, Tessa. Come spring," she echoed. He rode out as the first snow began to fall, looking back once to see her standing in the doorway of the store, one hand raised in farewell. Winter hit hard that year. The snow came in waves, piling up 6 feet deep, then 8, then 10. Kieran settled into the rhythm of winter survival, keeping the fire going, rationing supplies, checking his trap lines when the weather allowed. The solitude that had always been peaceful before felt oppressive now. The cabin felt empty. The silence felt heavy. He wrote letters he couldn't send, pages and pages of thoughts and observations and things he wanted to share. He imagined her responses, imagined her sitting by the fire in the room above the store, reading his words. Christmas came and went, marked only by the date on his calendar. January crawled past. February felt endless, but slowly, imperceptibly, the days began to lengthen. The sun climbed a little higher each afternoon. The snow started to melt. In Monticello, Tessa marked the passing winter in her own ways. She joined the choir and found that singing opened something in her chest that had been locked tight for years. She helped Gerald with the store, taking on more responsibility, learning the business. She had dinner with Mrs. Henderson every Sunday and slowly built friendships with other women in town. And she thought about Kieran, about his gentle hands and patient eyes, about the way he'd never pushed, never demanded, never made her feel like she owed him anything, about the life he'd offered and the question he'd asked. By the time March arrived, she knew her answer. The snow began to melt in earnest as March gave way to April. Kieran watched the trails emerge from under the white, watched the ice break up in the streams. He made it down to town on a warm day in mid-April, the first time in 5 months. Monticello looked the same but different, the way places do after long absence. Mud instead of snow, green shoots emerging in gardens, people moving with the energy of those who'd survived another winter. Kieran headed straight for the general store, his heart pounding harder than the ride warranted. The bell above the door chimed, and Tessa turned from where she was arranging a display. Their eyes met across the store, and for a moment neither of them moved. Then she was running, actually running, and Kieran caught her as she threw herself into his arms. He lifted her off her feet, spinning her once, and when he set her down, she was laughing and crying at the same time. "You came back," she said. "I promised I would. I know, but I was still afraid. What if there had been an accident? What if something had happened? What if he stopped her words with a kiss, soft and gentle and full of months of waiting?" She made a small sound of surprise, and then she was kissing him back, her hands fisting in his coat, pulling him closer. When they finally broke apart, Gerald was standing in the doorway to the back room, grinning like a fool. "About time," the old man said. "I was starting to think spring would never come." "It is here now," Tessa said, not looking away from Kieran. "It is finally here." Over the next 2 months, Kieran courted Tessa the way he'd promised. He came down from the mountain every few days, sometimes staying overnight, sometimes making the ride back in the dark. They went on walks, had dinners with Gerald and Mrs. Henderson as chaperones, attended church socials together, and they talked about everything, about what marriage would look like, what they each needed, what they feared. Tessa was honest about the scars Thomas had left, about the ways she still struggled sometimes with fear and doubt. Kieran was honest about his need for solitude sometimes, about the darkness he'd seen in the war that still haunted him on bad nights. "I am not perfect," Tessa said one evening as they sat on the bench outside the store. "I may never be completely healed." "I'm not looking for perfect," Kieran replied. "I'm looking for real, and you're the most real thing I've ever known." In late May, Kieran asked her formally. They were up at the cabin, which Tessa had visited several times now, growing more comfortable with the idea of the mountain life. He'd made dinner, venison stew with vegetables from Gerald's winter stores, and after they'd eaten, he got down on one knee. "I don't have a fancy ring," he said, "but I have this." He held out a band he'd carved from elk horn, smooth and polished. "Tessa Zimmerman, would you do me the honor of becoming my wife?" She pulled him to his feet, kissing him soundly before answering. "Yes, yes, absolutely yes." They were married in June in the small church in Monticello, with half the town in attendance. Gerald walked Tessa down the aisle, tears streaming down his weathered face, and Mrs. Henderson cried so hard she had to sit down halfway through the ceremony. Tessa wore a simple white dress that the church ladies had helped her sew, and she'd never looked more beautiful. Kieran wore his best shirt and pants, had trimmed his beard and hair, and felt like the luckiest man alive when the preacher pronounced them husband and wife. The kiss they shared was gentle and sweet and full of promise. They spent their wedding night at the hotel in town, Kieran endlessly patient as Tessa worked through her nervousness. He let her set the pace, let her initiate everything, and when she finally relaxed into his arms, he showed her what love was supposed to feel like. "I never knew it could be like this," she whispered afterwards, curled against his chest. "Gentle and good. This is how it's supposed to be," he said, stroking her hair. "Always." They moved up to the cabin for the summer, and Tessa learned the rhythms of mountain life. She helped Kieran with the garden he planted, learned to identify which plants were edible and which were poisonous, learned to fish in the cold streams that fed down from the peaks. It wasn't always easy. There were days when the isolation got to her, when she missed the sounds of the town and the company of other women. There were nights when nightmares about Thomas woke her shaking and afraid. But Kieran was always there, patient and steady, reminding her that she was safe, that she was loved, that she'd never have to face anything alone again. And slowly, the good days outnumbered the bad. Slowly, the nightmares came less frequently. Slowly, Tessa learned to trust in the life they were building. In late summer, they took a trip down to Monticello and didn't go back up. They talked about it and decided that, while the cabin would always be there for retreats and hunting seasons, Tessa needed more community than the mountain could provide. Kieran bought a piece of land on the edge of town and built them a house, smaller than the cabin but solidly made. It had 2 rooms downstairs and a loft above, with a porch that faced the mountains. Close enough to town for Tessa to have friends and community, far enough out that Kieran didn't feel crowded. He took work as a hunting guide, leading parties of wealthy Easterners into the mountains to hunt elk and bear. It paid better than trapping and meant he could sleep in his own bed most nights. Tessa helped Gerald in the store part-time and started a small business baking bread and pies to sell to the hotel and the miners. Life was good. Simple, but good. In the spring of their 2nd year of marriage, Tessa realized she was pregnant. She told Kieran on a Sunday evening, the 2 of them sitting on their porch watching the sunset paint the mountains purple and gold. "I am going to have a baby," she said, and her voice shook with joy and terror in equal measure. Kieran's face went through about 6 different expressions before landing on pure wonder. "A baby, we are going to have a baby. Are you happy?" "Happy." He pulled her into his arms, gentle as always, mindful of her even in his excitement. "Tessa, I am beyond happy. I am terrified and thrilled and amazed. A baby. I am scared," she admitted. "What if I am not a good mother? What if I do not know how? Then we will learn together, same as we've learned everything else. And you're going to be an amazing mother, I already know it." The pregnancy was not easy. Tessa was sick for the first 3 months, barely able to keep food down. Kieran hovered anxiously, bringing her dry toast and ginger tea, sitting with her when the nausea was worst. Mrs. Henderson came by regularly, bringing advice and company, and the church ladies rallied around her with meals and support. As her belly grew, Tessa's fears grew with it. Fears about the birth, about whether the baby would be healthy, about whether she could do this. But Kieran was always there, solid as the mountains, reminding her that she was stronger than she knew. Their son was born on a cold January night in 1891, with Mrs. Henderson serving as midwife and Kieran pacing the floor downstairs, until the old woman finally called him up to meet his child. Tessa lay exhausted in the bed, sweat-soaked and pale, but when Kieran entered the room she smiled. In her arms was a tiny bundle, red-faced and squalling. "We have a son," she said. "A healthy, strong son." Kieran approached slowly, reverently, and looked down at the baby. He had a shock of dark hair, and his tiny fists waved angrily at the injustice of being born. "He is perfect," Kieran breathed. "Tessa, he is absolutely perfect. Do you want to hold him?" Kieran took the baby carefully, cradling him in his large hands like he was made of glass. The baby quieted, staring up at him with unfocused eyes. "Hello there, little one," Kieran said softly. "I am your father, and I promise you right now, I am going to love you and protect you and make sure you know you are wanted every single day of your life." Tessa watched them, tears streaming down her face. Her husband and her son, her family, something she'd thought she'd never have, something she'd been too broken to hope for, but she'd healed, and she'd hoped, and here they were. They named him Nathan after Kieran's father, and if Kieran was determined to be a better father than his own had been, well, that was between him and his memories. Nathan thrived. He was a happy baby, easy with his smiles, and he grew like a weed. Kieran was a devoted father, coming home from guiding trips with stories and treasures for his son. Tessa found that motherhood suited her, that caring for this tiny person who depended on her completely brought her a peace she'd never known. When Nathan was 2, they had a daughter. They named her Rose, and she was quieter than her brother, more observant, but just as loved. 2 years after that came another son, Jacob, who was trouble from the moment he could crawl. Their house grew louder, more chaotic, filled with the sounds of children laughing and playing. Kieran added on 2 more rooms to accommodate their growing family. Tessa's baking business thrived, and she hired 2 other women to help her keep up with the demand. Gerald passed away peacefully in his sleep when Nathan was 5, and he left the general store to Tessa in his will. Kieran helped her run it, bringing his organizational skills and mountain knowledge to bear. It became the best-stocked store in 3 counties. The years passed, marked by birthdays and Christmases, by school performances and scraped knees, by quiet evenings on the porch after the children were asleep. Tessa's nightmares never completely went away, but they became rare, and when they came, Kieran was always there to hold her until she remembered where she was, who she was with, that she was safe. On their 10th anniversary, Kieran took Tessa back up to the cabin. The children stayed with Mrs. Henderson, who was in her 80s now but still spry enough to manage 3 energetic youngsters for a weekend. The cabin was exactly as they'd left it, preserved and waiting. They spent 2 days there, just the 2 of them, talking and laughing and making love and remembering who they'd been when they'd first found each other. On the 2nd evening, sitting on the porch watching the stars come out, Tessa leaned her head on Kieran's shoulder. "You ever regret it?" she asked. "Giving up your solitude, your simple life for all the chaos of a family?" "Not for 1 second," Kieran said firmly. "Do you regret taking a chance on a mountain man who didn't know the first thing about courting?" "Never." She laced her fingers through his. "You saved me, you know. Not just from Thomas, but from being afraid forever. You showed me that I could trust again, love again, live again." "We saved each other," Kieran corrected. "I was just existing before you, going through the motions. You gave me a reason to really live." They sat in comfortable silence, the kind that comes after years of knowing someone completely. The mountains rose dark against the starlit sky, eternal and unchanging. But they had changed, both of them, shaped by love and time into something better than they'd been alone. "I love you," Tessa said. "I know I say it all the time, but I want you to really hear it. I love you with everything I am." "I love you too," Kieran replied, pulling her closer. "Always have, always will." They went back down the mountain the next day, back to their children and their life and their community. But they carried the peace of that weekend with them, a reminder that underneath the busyness of daily life, they were still the mountain man and the girl who'd flinched, who'd found each other and chosen to be brave. The children grew. Nathan became a teacher, gentle and patient like his father. Rose surprised everyone by becoming a doctor, studying in Salt Lake City, and coming back to Monticello to practice. Jacob followed his father into the mountains, becoming a guide and trapper, though he came down more often than Kieran ever had. And through it all, Kieran and Tessa grew old together. They weathered storms and droughts, good years and bad. They buried Mrs. Henderson and half the town who'd been there when they were young. They welcomed grandchildren, and then great-grandchildren. On their 50th anniversary, the whole family gathered at the house. 3 children, 11 grandchildren, and 4 great-grandchildren filled every room with noise and laughter. Kieran, now 76 with silver hair and a deeply lined face, sat on the porch with Tessa, now 70, and watched the chaos with contentment. "Can you believe it has been 50 years?" Tessa asked, her hand in his like always. "Some days it feels like just yesterday I walked into that store and you dropped the baking powder," Kieran said. "Other days it feels like we have always been together. I was so afraid back then, of everything, of everyone. And now I am not afraid at all. How could I be with you beside me?" She squeezed his hand. "Thank you, Kieran, for being patient, for moving slowly, for giving me time to feel safe. Thank you for being brave enough to try, for taking a chance on me." Their grandson, Nathan's oldest boy, came running up to the porch. "Grandpa, tell us the story about how you and Grandma met." Soon all the children and grandchildren were gathered around, settling on the porch steps and the grass, calling for the story they'd all heard 100 times but never tired of. Kieran looked at Tessa, and she nodded with a smile. "Well," Kieran began, his voice still strong despite his years. "It was September of 1889, and I was a mountain man who came down to Monticello for supplies. And there, behind the counter of the general store, was the most beautiful girl I'd ever seen. But she was frightened of me and every other man, and I knew right then that if I wanted to know her, I'd have to move slowly and carefully, like approaching a wild creature that's been hurt." "And did you?" the youngest great-grandchild asked, eyes wide. "I did. I gave her space and time. I showed her through my actions that she was safe with me. And slowly, bit by bit, she started to trust again, started to heal, and somewhere in that process we fell in love. It was the best decision I ever made," Tessa added, "being brave enough to love again, to trust again. Your grandfather showed me that not all men are cruel, that I deserved kindness and patience and real love. And we built a life together," Kieran continued. "Right here in this house, in this town, at the foot of these mountains. It wasn't always easy, but it was always worth it." The children peppered them with questions, wanting to know every detail, and Kieran and Tessa obliged, telling the story together the way they'd lived their life together. As a team, as partners, as 2 people who'd found each other when they'd both needed it most, and had chosen each other every day since. As the sun set and the party continued inside, Kieran and Tessa remained on the porch, watching the mountains turn purple in the fading light. "You think we did good?" Tessa asked quietly. "With our life, I think we did better than good," Kieran said. "We took 2 broken people and made them whole. We built a family out of nothing but hope and hard work. We loved each other well and true for 50 years. If that's not a life well lived, I don't know what is." 50 years, Tessa marveled. "And I would do it all again in a heartbeat. Even the scary parts, even the hard parts, especially those parts, because those parts led me to you." Kieran lifted her hand to his lips and kissed it gently, the same gesture he'd made 1,000 times over the years. "I love you, Tessa Anderson. Today, tomorrow, and for whatever time we have left. I love you too, Kieran. Forever." They sat together as the stars came out, surrounded by the sounds of their family, anchored by the weight of 50 years of love and loyalty and choosing each other. The girl who'd flinched and the mountain man who'd moved slowly had built something beautiful together, something lasting. And as the night deepened and the mountains stood eternal watch, they knew that whatever came next, They would face it the same way they'd faced everything else, together.